Greetings and welcome to Flanigan's Ecologic. I'm your host, Ted Flanigan. And today I'm joined by Professor Michael Gerrard from Columbia University. He founded the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law there in 2009. He's a prolific writer. He has written so many papers. He's written books. He has spoken all over the world on the climate change and decarbonization and from an environmental law perspective. So just great to have Michael on the podcast today. Michael, welcome to the podcast. It's great to meet you.
Thank you for having me.
And tell me, where are you? You're somewhere in the New York area, I presume.
I'm at home. I live in Westchester County, about 30 miles north of New York City.
Oh, very good. I grew up in Manhattan and then on Long Island. Oyster Bay was our family home. So I've introduced you as a professor at Columbia, and so you make the commute into the university X number of times a week?
That's right. I drive my electric car 1.5 miles to the Metro North train station.
You're like me. I like to say the best place for an EV is at a metro station. That's fantastic. How long have you had your EV?
I guess I've had it for about 5 years, and its two predecessors were hybrids.
Yeah. Isn't it great how this transition is taking place? So what are you working on today or this week? What's the focus these days?
Well, New York City was about to introduce something called congestion pricing, which meant that everybody who went into the central business district by car or vehicle needed to pay $15. Right before it was supposed to be launched, Governor Hochul put it on indefinite pause. And so I'm leading a legal effort to sue the governor and saying that she didn't have the power to stop congestion pricing. So we have several lawsuits in the works to try to implement what we see as a very, very important environmental measure.
Do you think that she just caved to the political pressure of everybody being upset about this $15 fee?
Yeah, the story she tells is she went into a diner and talked to some people who were grieving about the fee, and she didn't want to impose a cost on consumers. That may have been it. It may have been other kinds of political pressure, but we think she didn't have the legal authority to do that, and that's what our lawsuits are about.
And you're bucking the popular, I don't know, feeling. It seems like I was just back in New York and watching the news when she announced that, and it seemed like the news agencies were presenting it as with great relief that New Yorkers would not have to endure this congestion pricing.
Well, I can tell you that certainly the environmental community and the organizations that represent transit riders and so forth are extremely unhappy with what she did.
Yeah.
The congestion pricing was essential not only to reduce traffic congestion, but also to fund the capital program for the MTA, which desperately needs the money.
Right. And there are other great examples where congestion pricing has been effective. I think of maybe Oslo, Norway, and is it London
and Singapore. Everywhere it's been unpopular when they first put it forth, but after a while, people come to see it really works.
Yeah, right.
It's very popular there.
So how do you get that back on course? I guess pushing against the governor's order.
That's right. We're going to ask a court to declare that she couldn't do that. All the equipment has been installed. It's ready to go. The MTA is immensely frustrated that they couldn't turn it on.
Interesting.
Hopefully we'll fix that.
So you're embroiled in a battle back there in New York right now.
One of several I've been embroiled in, but that's the battle du jour.
Yeah. Well, good. Yeah, now, are you a New Yorker through and through? Were you born and raised in the New York area and been there ever since, or
I grew up in Charleston, West Virginia.
Huh.
And that's a town that is dominated by the petrochemical industry. So our house was literally on the banks of the Kanawha River, which when I was a kid growing up was filthy because it received the waste from DuPont and Monsanto and Union Carbide and so forth. So I grew up in a very polluted area, and that was the beginning of my interest in the environment, growing up amid all that pollution.
Yeah. I wondered how that came about. But then you came up to New York for college, it looks like.
That's right. I moved to New York when I was 17 to go to Columbia at a college, and basically haven't left.
And what was your career path then? Was it environmentally rooted even at that early age?
Well, I originally wanted to, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an astrophysicist until high school calculus, and that was the end of that. And then I wanted to be, in college, I wanted to be a journalist, and I was a reporter for the Columbia Daily Spectator. My first job out of college was with the Charleston Bureau of the Associated Press, but I became a West Virginia press secretary for the McGovern for President campaign. In 1972, he was running against Nixon, and then the Illinois press secretary, and then I lost my job because Nixon won the election, and I got a job with an environmental group in New York City. I worked there for 2 years and decided to become an environmental lawyer. So I entered law school in 1975 for the purpose of becoming an environmental lawyer.
What was the environmental group?
It was called the Mayor's Council on the Environment of New York City, and it has since morphed into a group called Grow NYC, which runs the green markets in New York City.
Oh, very interesting. So you then you went to law school, New York University School of Law, with a focus on environmental law.
Right.
At that time. And then, as I understand it, had 30-year career working at a law firm. And was that all environmental litigation, all those years?
It was all environmental law. I went to work right after graduation for a little environmental boutique law firm called Burley, Cass & Case. And I was there for 15 years. And the firm broke up in 1994. And I moved laterally to the New York office of a big firm called Arnold & Porter, and I was a partner there for 15 years.
And when you think about the cases that are most impressionable to you, what are those? What were you working on?
Well, one of the more interesting cases is a real estate developer in New York, a fellow who was mostly known then as a real estate developer named Donald Trump, wanted to build a golf course in Westchester County in a very affluent area, but it was right next to a drinking water reservoir called Byram Lake that was the sole source of drinking water for a town that has a high Hispanic population called Mount Kisco. So Mount Kisco was worried that the pesticides from the golf course would contaminate their drinking water, and they hired me to try to stop the golf course. And we found ways to do that using the Clean Water Act and some other statutes. And ultimately, Trump was not able to build that golf course, and the drinking water supply of Mount Kisco was saved.
Very good. How about another one?
So the very first big case I was involved in is there was a proposal to build a big highway, which was going to be called Westway. And they were going to fill in 10% of the cross-section of the Hudson River between the Battery at the bottom end of the island and 42nd Street, and run a highway in a landfill, in a tunnel through this landfill. And we represented the Sierra Club and other groups in litigating against it, and ultimately killed the highway, and the city and the state were able to use a provision of federal law that allowed the $2 billion that would have gone to build a highway to instead go to a small replacement road and mostly go to mass transit to improve the subway and bus system.
In that west side of New York now, isn't there a nice pedestrian and cycling pathway there?
Exactly. So the road that they built is called 9A, but there's a lovely, as you say, pedestrian and bikeway all along it, and lots of other uses have arisen along the west side of Manhattan. All the piers would have been torn down. Legally, the most important part is that the area around the piers were the important habitat of the striped bass, and there hadn't been adequate environmental review of the impact on the striped bass. So the striped bass were saved, and the piers are still there, most of them, and a lot of them have become recreational piers.
Yeah.
And we now have you can bicycle all the way from the battery at the bottom end of the island to the George Washington Bridge toward the top.
That is so great. And interesting that the striped bass would be the where the battle was won, it sounds like. When clearly what you had in mind, and you and many others, was a whole vision for what that could be, right? Or
Exactly.
at least what it should not be. One big highway.
For several years, we were mostly fighting it on air pollution grounds,
Yeah.
and those cases lost. But this, as is often the case with environmental law, you find hooks. You find legal hooks.
Right.
That's what we used here.
Wasn't it? What was the snail darter? Was another one, wasn't it? Wasn't there going to be some dam built somewhere in, I want to say, Tennessee or something?
In Tennessee, the Tennessee Valley Authority was going to build a dam that it turned out would be very bad for a little fish called the snail darter.
Yeah.
The first really important lawsuit under the Endangered Species Act was involved with the snail darter. The thing is that although the Supreme Court said that building the dam would violate the Endangered Species Act, Congress then stepped in with a midnight amendment and said that the dam had to be built, and so the dam ended up being built. But the snail darter actually survived, but that's a whole other story.
And then another one that came to mind when you were talking, Michael, was about, the Ivanpah solar generating stations here that are out in the California desert as you approach Nevada, and they're these huge. Are you familiar with this? These huge towers, and a friend of mine was involved with getting those permitted, and there was some sort of a desert tortoise or some sort of a desert turtle or something like that they had to. The amount of remediation that had to be done was extreme, but they did build the project at the end of the day.
And what that really raises is a very important issue that often arises, that in order to solve the climate problem or to reduce its worst impacts, we're going to need to build a huge amount of new renewable energy, mostly wind and solar.
Yeah.
And there are trade-offs involved, because there's no place you can build that has zero impacts. There will be some impacts, and you have to mitigate them to the extent you can. But sub-litigation has stopped a lot of these facilities because of the effect, whether it's on the desert tortoise or whatever it is. It's a problem, and I think I think overall we have to confront the trade-offs that are involved in these important decisions to address the climate problem.
Yeah, I totally agree. The trade-offs are really important, and as you're talking, it sounds like you need the legal profession, you, and your arguments to figure out where are those legal hooks as you described it. But then you also need you need the public to be kind of coming along with you, right? You need maybe it's the environmental group, the NGOs that are raising the awareness, so that you've got the popular support.
The most important decisions tend to be made by elected officials, and litigation can stop some things from happening. It can drive some other things to happen, but the most important decisions are really made by elected officials who are influenced by public opinion, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, after you practiced law in the private sector, you decided to shift into academia. What prompted that?
So in 2008, I've been practicing for 30 years, and I had a great run and really enjoyed it. But 2 years earlier, I'd started work on a book, which became the first edition of my book, Global Climate Change in U.S. Law. And the more I worked on that, the more concerned I became about the climate problem, and began to feel I should really try to find a way to devote myself to that. So in 2008, to my surprise, I received a call from the Dean of Columbia Law School saying, we need somebody to join the faculty to teach environmental law. Are you interested in talking to us about that? So I gave it a lot of thought, talked to my wife, called the dean back and said, how about if I join your faculty to teach environmental law and also start up a center on climate change law?
Yeah.
And he said, okay. And
that's pretty sweet. But had you been looking at shifting from the law practice to academia? I mean, the book got you going, it sounds like.
I had thought about it, and my father was a college professor. My brother's a college professor, so
Oh, okay.
it's in the family. Um, and I enjoyed practicing law, and I had already written several books, but this was a very attractive move.
Sounds like it. Well, congratulations. And then I know that you inspired students. One of my employees is one of your students, and that's why we're here together in the podcast. But I wanted to ask you, are you inspired by the students? I mean, are you getting that sort of back and forth that's quite fulfilling?
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the best things about teaching is
Yeah.
that people you teach, and they really are passionately interested in it. It's not I teach environmental law and climate change law and energy regulation, and these are not required courses. They're all taking it because they want to. But a lot
Yeah.
of the students are really deeply concerned about these issues, as they should be. And so it's wonderfully fulfilling to be in these rooms with these bright young people who care about what you care about, and I try to help them out and help them with their careers and otherwise help guide them.
And I think you would say also they really help us out. I mean, they're bringing in all these young perspectives. I mean, sometimes I feel so sure that I know that my perspective is the correct one, and then the next generation is like, hey, wait a second, here's the way we're looking at this.
Absolutely. They come up with all kinds of interesting ideas. Some of them make
Yeah,
sense, some of them don't.
yeah,
But I,
of
I
course.
welcome them, and I encourage all of this, and it's really terrific.
Let's talk about the Sabin Center just for a second. And am I right that the Sabin family was into precious metals? Was that there? Is that the background of this center in terms of financial support?
Yes, there's a fellow named Andy Sabin who was actually a client of mine practicing law. He's in the precious metals recovery business. He, has some plants that, for instance, take old printed circuit boards and extract the precious metals from them, a form of
Hmm.
recycling. Um, but he's also a big fan of endangered species, especially the salamander. And after I'd done a lot of regular conventional environmental work for him, he became very concerned because there was a plan to expand a discount shopping mall on Long Island, to expand it into a salamander habitat. And so he asked me to see what I could do about that. And I found another very obscure law that allowed us to challenge that. And we ended up, uh, the developer of the mall, a fellow named Steve Tanger, this was called the Tanger Mall, and his lawyer and I and Andy Sabin sat in my conference room and redesigned the mall so that it avoided the salamander habitat.
Really, really.
Uh, um, but that cemented my relationship with Andy
Yeah.
Sabin. And then when I moved to Columbia, he endowed my professorship, and a few years later, he endowed our center, and so we renamed it the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law.
Well, thanks to him. How great. And what does the center have a specific mission, or how would you characterize it?
Well, what the way we describe it is the Sabin Center um, develops legal techniques to fight climate change. It trains the next generation of lawyers to use those techniques and to be involved in climate issues. And we do a great deal of research and create databases and other information that are used by lawyers and judges and students and scholars around the world. So we have our most famous product is a database of all the climate litigation in the world. There are now about 2,600 cases globally, and the database is used by all the lawyers globally who are involved in this litigation. And it helps them to immediately gain access to this, to
Yeah,
know who's sued what over whom, what the courts have said, and so forth.
that makes a lot of sense. And then from a very lay perspective like myself, is it fair to say that different centers, different law schools will have these different focuses or kind of niches? Like you mentioned, you have a product. I mean, that's sort of new to me.
Yeah, I mean that's only one of the many many things we do, but we do have
Yeah.
that product. I mean there are two other climate centers at U.S. law schools, one at Georgetown
Hmm.
and one at UCLA, and all three were created around the same time, 2008 and 2009, which was a time when Obama was coming in, and we thought we were soon going to have major climate legislation. The House of Representatives in 2009 narrowly passed the Waxman-Markey bill. One of our first projects at the Sabin Center was to put together a database of all the regulations that it would require, about 150 of them, and we were getting ready to work with the scientists at Columbia's Earth Institute to help in implementing it, but that law never passed.
So, what percentage of your time are you teaching versus researching, writing? How do you split your...
That's hard to estimate, but I would say during the school year when we're teaching, I probably spend maybe half of my time getting ready for class because the subjects change all the time, and the other half working with colleagues from the Sabin Center and doing other writing and so forth.
Well, and how do you crank out all those articles you've just written? I mean, your resume is fantastic. Do you love to write? Do you get up early in the morning and write like a madman, and then have coffee, or other way around, or what?
Well, it's more weekends and vacations and evenings and so forth. I don't golf or go to the opera, so I spend a lot of my free time writing.
Yeah, that's great. I wanted to ask you about the Marshall Islands. It sounds like that's been, am I right that that's been one of your emphases?
In 2010, I guess, shortly after I moved to Columbia, I unexpectedly received a call from the ambassador from the Marshall Islands to the United Nations. And he said, some decade, we don't know what decade it is, but some decade we're going to be underwater. And that raises a whole host of legal issues. If a country is underwater, is it still a state? Does it still have a seat at the United Nations? What happens? What is the citizenship of its displaced people? Do we have any legal claims against greenhouse gas emitters? So I didn't know the answers to those questions offhand, but we convened a big conference on the legal issues faced by threatened island nations. And produced a book, and I've done a lot of work with the Marshall Islands. I've been there twice and have become deeply involved in these issues of sea level rise and population displacement and so forth.
So what is the answer? I mean, the Marshall Islands are, what are they, just a few feet above sea level, and the sea level is rising, and how can we save those islands?
Yeah, and so as you know, they're in the middle of the Pacific, about halfway between Hawaii and Australia, and they want the residents of the Marshall Islands want to stay as long as they possibly can, and so there are various adaptation measures to try to provide them with reliable drinking water, and elevate the buildings to a certain extent. But they're not going to be able to do that forever, and eventually they'll have to. The population will have to leave. Meanwhile, the Marshall Islands is where the U.S. conducted a lot of its outdoor nuclear weapons testing. Between 1947 and 1959, they dropped 67 nuclear weapons over the Marshall Islands, over the atolls of Bikini and Eniwetok. And in very partial recompense for that, when the country became independent in 1986, the U.S. Entered into an agreement where people from the Marshall Islands may come to the U.S. freely and work. And they don't need a visa. They don't have a path to citizenship, but they can work. And there are now around, nobody knows the exact number, but there are around 15,000 people from the Marshall Islands living in and around Springfield, Arkansas, because a guy from the Marshall Islands sort of randomly got a job at the Tyson's chicken plant in Springfield, and it went well, and a cousin came over, and before you know it, you have this large population of Marshallese living in northwestern Arkansas. And such a large portion of the population of the country lives there that if you're running for president of the Marshall Islands, you go to Arkansas to
To
campaign.
campaign? Oh my gosh. Are there several other countries that are similarly threatened, like the Marshall Islands are?
Yeah, so the Marshall Islands are an atoll nation, and an atoll, as you know, is sort of the rim of an extinct volcano.
Hmm.
So there are about 5 other countries that are atoll nations: the Maldives, Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, Palau, and then there are a lot of other countries like uh, uh, Kiribati and others that may have some elevation. In the Marshall Islands, the highest point is about 6 feet above sea level,
Wow. Yeah.
and so they're really in trouble. But there are a lot of these island nations are in severe danger. I mean, one of the times I was there, I asked, "Well, what happens? What do you do if you get a tsunami warning?" And he said, "Well, tie yourself to a tree."
Yeah. Yeah. How do you balance your optimism in situations like these? It sounds like sea level rising. You characterize it as a fait accompli. It's going to happen. They're going to have to move at some point. But Simon, my employee who took a class with you, said you're always quite optimistic, and I think he said you basically have said you just do everything you can do, uh, and then you take care of your family. But is that you? Is that how you
Yeah,
handle?
I mean, the first day of class one semester, a student asked, "How do you do this? How do you keep it up?" And I said, "I do what I can,
Do what you can. Yeah,
and that's all you can do. But it's comforting to do what I can. I can't tell you that I'm confident that we're going to avoid a whole lot of bad impacts of climate change. It's already
yeah,
happening. It's going to
yeah.
get worse, but I think each of us can do our bit."
And you had an LA Times article not that long ago saying that the climate change war is not being lost.
I think I said the climate change war is not over. And that was after the Supreme Court issued one of its many horrible decisions. This was a case called West Virginia versus EPA, in which the court um, reduced, in effect, reduced EPA's power under the Clean Air Act to address the problem with coal-fired power plants. But there's still a lot of other legal tools that are available and that we're trying to develop. Obviously, the outcome of November's election will make an enormous difference. And when young people ask me, what can they personally do to affect climate change? I say, well, between now and November, the most important thing you can personally do is go to a swing state and help with voter registration, because the outcome of the election is not only the most important thing for climate change and many other things, but it's actually more important than everything else combined with respect to climate change.
Yeah, this is your passion.
Exactly, and these are extremely important issues to me and to lots of people.
Absolutely. Last question on decarbonizing. Are there legal hooks for decarbonizing? Are they the same legal hooks for mitigating climate change, or is there something new?
So in 2019, another law professor, John Dernbach, and I put out a book called Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization in the United States. It's a book of about 1,200 pages. We had a team of 30 lawyers around the country, mostly law professors, writing chapters. And so a very, very long list of legal tools that can be used. And growing out of that, we started up a project called Model Laws for Deep Decarbonization, where several dozen law firms, all working pro bono, are drafting the model laws that are needed to carry out the recommendations in the book.
Okay, that's fantastic. And how do you maintain balance in your life? You've got a lot going on.
Well, I have 2 little grandchildren and a third on the way, and they're an immense source of joy and motivation to do
Yeah,
what I can do.
that's really great. Hey, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Ted. I enjoyed it.
That's it. Thanks for listening to Flanigan's Ecologic. We'll see you next time.